Ever watched a drone just like zip through a forest,
Yeah.
weaving between buildings or pulling off stunts that seem, I don't know, downright impossible? We're not talking about your grandma's aerial photography rig here. This is FPV drone territory, and today's deep dive is about to get your heart racing.
You know what I think is so fascinating about FPV drones is their incredible diversity and how they kind of turn the whole flying experience into something truly immersive. Forget about, calmly snapping photos from a distance. We're talking about strapping on goggles and actually, becoming the pilot.
Okay, becoming the pilot. Now that sounds kind of intense. But before we get lost in the rush, can we unpack what FPV first-person view actually means for someone who's totally new to this whole thing?
Okay, so imagine this. You put on these goggles, right? And suddenly you're not looking up at a drone in the sky anymore. You're seeing the world through its camera. So you experience every tilt, every turn, every dive as if you're actually right there in the cockpit. It's sensory overload, but in the best way possible.
Okay, that makes those crazy FPV videos online make way more sense. So it's not just about the drone itself. It's about the skill of the person actually, piloting it.
100%. It's completely different from other types of drone flying where you might, hit a ceiling based on what the tech can do. FPV is all about pushing your own abilities as a pilot. That drone, it basically becomes an extension of your reflexes, your spatial awareness, how you make decisions under pressure. It's almost like a sport in a way.
A sport where your equipment just happens to be a tiny flying machine with propellers. Makes sense. Our source, Oscar Liang, is a big advocate for simulator time before you even touch a real FPV drone. He recommends, at least 10 hours. Is that really necessary? Or is he just being super cautious?
Honestly, it's more crucial than people realize. Imagine trying to, drive a race car without any practice on a track first. FPV flying, it's a lot about muscle memory. It's those split-second adjustments that need to become instinctual. And simulators let you build those skills safely. So when you do take to the actual sky, you're not, battling those basic controls on top of everything else.
So instead of crashing a several $100 drone, you're crashing a virtual one. Okay, I can definitely get behind that logic.
Exactly. Plus, the crazy thing is, modern simulators are shockingly realistic. They can mimic things like wind resistance, different models of drones, even different weather conditions. It's the closest you can get to the real deal without, the risk.
And speaking of the real deal, Oscar points out that getting started with FPV doesn't have to, completely drain your bank account.
Yeah.
That's kind of surprising given all the tech involved.
Yeah, it's a common myth that FPV requires this huge investment upfront. You can actually get a pretty decent setup for around the same price as one of those basic camera drones.
Yeah.
From those big companies.
That's good news for anyone whose interest is officially piqued right now. Okay, so let's say I've put in my simulator hours and I'm ready for an actual drone. Where do I even begin to choose? Because it seems like there are just endless options out there.
That's where your flying style comes into play. Oscar breaks it down into 4 main categories. There's freestyle, racing, long range, and cinematic. Each one demands different things from a drone.
Okay, let's break those down a little because freestyle, that just sounds like pure adrenaline.
Oh, it totally is. Think flips, rolls, dives. You're basically turning the sky into your own personal, aerial acrobatic show. And for that, you really want a drone that's tough, durable, because crashes are kind of inevitable as you're, experimenting with what's possible.
Right, makes sense. And then there's racing, which I imagine requires a whole different kind of machine.
For sure. Racing drones are all about speed and agility. They're super stripped down, lightweight, and every single component is optimized for pure performance. Imagine, the Formula One cars of the sky. They're built for those tight turns and those, neck-breaking speeds.
Okay, now long-range FPV, that sounds incredibly intriguing to me. What's the main appeal there?
It's about pushing those boundaries, right? How far can you go? How long can you stay in the air? These drones, they're not just about speed, it's endurance. So they need extended battery life, strong video signals that can travel long distances, and they often even use GPS for navigation.
Okay, last but not least, cinematic FPV. That sounds almost, contradictory to me. Isn't FPV all about speed and crazy maneuvers? How do you get those smooth cinematic shots with all that going on?
Oh, you'd be surprised. Cinematic FPV, it's this cool blend. You've got the immersive perspective, the maneuverability of an FPV drone, but you're aiming for those smooth flowing shots you see in professional videos. It requires a seriously skilled pilot who can basically make the drone like an extension of their artistic vision,
So you got to have the skills to back up the tech. That definitely makes sense. But with all these different drone styles, how does someone just starting out even like choose their path?
That's where Oscar has a great tip, and it actually might surprise some people. He recommends a 5-peg drone as the kind of the sweet spot for beginners.
Okay.
They offer like a really great balance between performance and versatility, which lets you can dabble in different styles before you commit to a super specialized drone.
So don't limit yourself too early on, basically. Okay, so you found your style, you're ready to commit to a real drone, but then you hit another fork in the road, right?
Mm-hmm.
Build or buy? Does it even matter which path you take these days?
It's the classic FPV dilemma. And honestly, it's a tougher choice than ever now. You've got fantastic pre-built options that are practically ready to fly right out of the box. But then you have the whole DIY route, which can be incredibly rewarding.
I bet, but also maybe a little intimidating for someone just starting out.
It can be. It can be. But here's the thing, and Oscar really stresses this. Even for people who buy pre-built drones, learning some basic soldering and repair, absolutely essential.
Why is that? Is it really that different from other tech where you just, send it back for repair if something goes wrong?
Because crashes, they're just part of the game, especially when you're getting comfortable with FPV. Totally. Yeah. Imagine being grounded because like one tiny component came loose and you're just sitting there clueless about how to fix it. Trust me, it happens all the time. Learning basic soldering and repair, it not only gets you back in the air faster, it's like it unlocks this whole world of customization and upgrades down the line.
So it's about becoming more than just a pilot. You're like understanding the soul of the machine a little bit. I like it. But let's not forget, you need more than just the drone itself, right? What are some of those other essential pieces of gear that we really shouldn't skimp on?
Okay, so beyond the drone itself, you've got your holy trinity. Your goggles, your radio controller, and your batteries. And these, trust me, they're not just like accessories. These things can make or break the entire FPV experience.
Okay, let's start with those goggles. Those are our window into that immersive first-person perspective we keep hearing about around.
Exactly. But here's the thing, and I cannot stress this enough. Cheap goggles equal headaches, literally. We're talking low resolution, poor latency, all those things just completely ruin that feeling of immersion and can even leave you feeling like kind of nauseous. Invest in some good goggles though, and you will be rewarded with a crystal clear, lag-free view that puts you right there in the pilot's seat.
Got it. So invest in good goggles. Now the radio controller. That's how we actually control the drone's every move.
More than just steering. A good radio, it gives you fine-grained control over every single aspect of the drone's movement. So we're talking, throttle, yaw, pitch, roll, everything. Plus, it often comes with features that are like super crucial for things like tuning and safety. Having a cheap radio can be the difference between a super smooth flight and a disastrous one.
So invest in a good radio. Got it. Now batteries. This one seems pretty straightforward. You need them to fly. More is always better, right?
True, that part is true. But here's the catch. FPV drones, they are power-hungry beasts. Flight times, they can be super short, especially if you're pushing the drone to its limits. Invest in those high-quality batteries, have enough for a good solid flying session, and always, always, always carry spares. There's nothing worse than showing up to like a flying field with 1 bar of battery left and just a whole lot of disappointment.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a huge bummer. Okay, so we've covered all the gear. Now let's pop the hood on this whole FPV thing.
Yeah.
What is actually going on inside these tiny little machines that gives them that insane agility, that responsiveness?
It might seem like magic, but really it's like this beautifully choreographed dance between software, sensors, and those powerful little motors. But at the heart of it all is the flight controller. That's like the brain of the drone.
So that's where the magic happens.
In a way, yeah. So the flight controller, its job is to take all the information from those sensors, things like gyroscopes, accelerometers, which tell it the drone's orientation, like where it is in space, how it's moving. And then, get this, it processes all of that information in real time, making like thousands of tiny adjustments every single second to keep that drone stable and responsive to your commands.
Wow. Okay. So when I move the stick on my controller, the flight controller basically takes that and turns it into commands for the motors.
Exactly. It decides how much power gets sent to each motor, in what direction, at what speed, all to execute that maneuver that you've commanded. And this is where those ESCs that we talked about earlier, those
Yeah.
electronic speed controllers, those guys come into play.
Right. So they're like the middlemen between that flight controller and the actual motors, making sure everything's talking to each other.
Exactly. They take the signals from the flight controller and translate them into power for the motors. And because FPV drones, they need such precise control, you need ESCs that are up to the task. Ones that can handle rapid changes in speed and direction without breaking a sweat. And this is like super important when you start getting into the weeds and choosing between different types of ESCs, like whether you're running 4S or 6S, which basically determines the voltage that they can handle and directly impacts how much power your drone has, how it performs.
Okay, so the type of ESC matters too. Good to know, good to know. But it all comes down to those motors in the end, right? Those are the tiny things responsible for all that power and agility we've been talking about.
Absolutely. FPV motors, they're designed for both crazy high RPMs and those like super rapid changes in speed and direction that we've been talking about. Think of them like the high performance engines in a
Yeah.
sports car. They got to be able to deliver those bursts of speed and torque on demand.
That's just mind-blowing how much tech gets packed into such a small package. It really is. But we haven't even touched on the whole FPV part yet, right? Like what I'm seeing in my goggles, how does that actually get there?
Yeah. That's where the real magic of FPV comes in. It all starts with that FPV camera, that tiny little camera that's mounted on the very front of the drone. Now, this camera, it's not your typical high-resolution, super fancy camera. It's not about taking pretty pictures. It's about prioritizing something called low latency, which basically means that it can transmit the video almost instantaneously. Speed over picture quality, that's what it's all about.
So it's all about that instant feedback for the pilot, not necessarily about capturing those like Instagram-worthy shots.
Exactly. So that FPV camera, it sends its video feed to something called a video transmitter, or VTX for short, that's on the drone. And then the VTX transmits that signal wirelessly to a receiver in your goggles, which is called the VRX.
Okay, so it's like my drone has its own mini TV station broadcasting directly to my face.
That's actually a great way to put it. And just like with, any kind of TV broadcast, the quality of that signal, the clarity of the image, it all depends on a few things.
Like what? Is it just as simple as having a good VTX? Is that all it takes?
It's a little more nuanced than that. While having a good VTX definitely helps, one of the most critical factors is antenna placement.
Okay.
Think of those little antennas on your drone and your goggles like they're tiny little satellite dishes.
Yep.
They need to be positioned correctly so they can send and receive the strongest possible signal.
So again, it's not just about having the best equipment. It's about actually understanding how to use it well, how to use it effectively.
100%, yeah. Yeah, it's almost like, imagine like flashlights, right? For the strongest signal, you want those beams of light, or in this case, those radio waves pointed directly at each other.
So my VTX antenna on the drone and the antennas on my goggles should be like facing each other as much as possible.
Ideally, yes. But of course, when your drone is, flipping and rolling through the air, that's not always super realistic.
Yeah, that's where I imagine the whole FPV thing gets really, really real.
Exactly. But even when you can't keep that, like, perfect line of sight, understanding how to position those antennas can make a huge difference. Even small adjustments can, like, drastically improve your signal, how clear it is, how far it can go. It's one of those subtle things that separates, the casual FPV pilot from someone who's truly experienced.
It's like any skill, I guess. The more you understand those little nuances, those little details, the better you become.
Yeah, totally. And it's not even just about, like, avoiding obstacles. You can actually use the environment to your advantage. Experienced pilots can use, like, trees, buildings, even the contours of the land to, like, bounce their signal and extend their range even further. It's almost like they're playing, I don't know, a game of 3D chess with the environment.
Now that you mention it, I've seen some FPV videos where the footage goes from, crystal clear to little glitchy for just a second, then back to normal. Am I right in guessing that's the signal being interrupted for a second?
Spot on. That's what we call breakup in the FPV world. It's a sign that something's, interfering with the signal between your drone and your goggles. Could be an actual, like, physical obstacle, interference from other electronic devices, or you're just pushing the limits of how far your gear can transmit.
So those moments of static It's like a little warning sign that something's not quite right.
Exactly. Now, speaking of footage, remember how we talked about the FPV camera? How it prioritizes that low latency, that really fast transmission speed over raw image quality?
Yeah, it's all about that instant feedback for the pilot, not about taking, pretty pictures for the gram or whatever.
Right. But then that raises the question, how are all those crazy high-definition, super cinematic FTV videos we see online, how are those being captured?
Okay, yeah, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. If it's not coming from the FPV camera, where's that amazing footage coming from?
It's pretty clever, actually. To get those amazing visuals, those really stunning shots, FPV pilots will often mount a completely separate HD action camera to their drone, like think GoPros, Insta360s, those kinds of cameras.
So they're basically strapping a professional-grade camera onto this tiny, crazy agile flying machine.
That's wild. Although I'm guessing it's probably not as easy as just like attaching any old camera and hoping for the best.
You're right, there's a real art to it.
Yeah.
It starts with choosing the right camera, but that's only step one. Different cameras have different strengths. Pilots need to consider things like resolution, frame rate, field of view, even the camera's ability to handle vibrations.
Yeah, you don't want the vibrations from those powerful motors ruining an otherwise perfectly good shot.
Exactly. A lot of pilots will actually use these specialized mounts that are specifically designed to isolate the camera from those vibrations. It's how they keep the footage, buttery smooth, even when they're doing those super intense maneuvers.
And I bet actually flying with an HD camera attached adds like a whole other level of complexity, right? For sure. Remember, you're still seeing the world through those goggles, through the drone's eyes. So any sudden movements, anytime you have to overcorrect the controls, is all amplified in the footage. It takes a ton of skill and like finesse to be able to pilot smoothly and capture those breathtaking shots at the same time.
So it's almost like you have to be a pilot and a cinematographer at the same time.
Exactly. It's a whole other level.
This has been an awesome deep dive, but man, it's also a lot to take in. So for anyone listening who's like, okay, I'm completely new to this, but I'm hooked, where do I even begin? What would you say?
The awesome thing is the FPV community is amazing. There are more resources available today than ever before. For starters, simulators are your best friend. They let you learn the ropes, experiment with different setups, and you can crash as much as you want with no consequences.
Like driver's ed, but for drone pilots.
100%. Once you've got some confidence in the simulator, then it's all about finding your little niche, finding your community, your people within, like, the bigger world of FPV.
Find your people, those who share that passion and can, guide you along the way.
And honestly, don't be afraid to start small. You don't need, like, the most expensive drone, the fanciest gear to have fun and learn.
Speaking of fun, I feel like that's something we haven't explicitly talked about yet. It's easy to get, caught up in all the technical stuff, but at its heart, FPV flying is about pure, unadulterated fun.
100%. That feeling of, soaring through the air, navigating obstacles, pulling off moves that seem physically impossible, it's just exhilarating. And that sense of accomplishment you get when you finally nail a new trick or fly a perfect lap, it's incredibly rewarding.
And those aha moments when something just clicks. Those are what make the whole learning process so addictive.
Totally. But I think what's really cool is that FPV, it goes beyond just being, a hobby. It actually teaches you skills, reflexes, hand-eye coordination, decision-making under pressure that can really benefit other areas of your life.
Well, it's like personal growth with a side of adrenaline. I like it.
Yeah.
But on a more serious note, what advice would you give to someone who's feeling that initial hesitation, that fear of failing to learn something new?
Embrace the crashes. Seriously. They're going to happen, especially when you're starting out. Don't look at it as failure. Think of it as a learning experience. Figure out what happened, fix it, get back in the air. That's it.
It's all part of the process.
Exactly. And remember what Oscar said, learning to repair your own drone. It's all part of becoming a true FPV pilot.
It's like that old saying, give a man a fish.
And you'll fly for a day. Teach a man to fix his drone and he'll discover a world of possibilities.
Perfectly put. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the incredible world of FPV drones, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away?
If you've ever felt even the slightest bit of curiosity about FPV, don't ignore it. Dive in, explore, and just see where this crazy journey takes you.
I love that. Beautifully said. And remember, even if you never end up, flying like a pro, there is so much joy, so much excitement to be found just outside of your comfort zone.
And who knows, you might just surprise yourself with what you're capable of.
Until next time, everyone, happy flying.